grateful for this opportunity to share some of the things I've learned over the years as a youth settlement worker. And I wanted to start off with this image of this cat in the boat that you see here, because I thought it really reminded me, I guess, of the work that I do with newcomer youth and perhaps you as well. I like to imagine that if I was maybe the cat in this boat, or our clients or the youth that we work with, how the boat that they're in is kind of the resources that we develop or we advocate for, or that we co-create with the youth we work with, navigating the changing waters as they adjust to a new environment when they come to Canada. And I also like that this image has this little flag with the heart, because I think, at least for me, that really helps me to navigate some really tough work situations, I think, with the youth we work with. So a bit about myself. I'm a queer Chinese Australian, and I migrated to Canada by way of Hong Kong and Nam, otherwise known as Melbourne, and I currently reside in Toronto. I'm a registered social worker, and I've worked with youth, families and seniors in community settings for over 10 years. I love art making, storytelling, and bringing expressive approaches to working with individuals and groups. And currently I'm working with newcomer youth at West Neighbourhood House, as I mentioned, as a youth settlement worker. And I also recently began working with teens across the GTA as a therapist. All of that being said, I don't think of myself as an expert here, but I'm just offering a bit of my perspective as a youth worker. And I hope that through this presentation and the exercise we do together later, that you're also able to take away some of that and perhaps feel more resourced and more buoyant in the work you do with newcomer youth. So an overview of what I will talk about today, I want to unpack what we mean by newcomer youth and just that identity piece, and as well as how newcomer youth navigate education systems and the strengths and challenges that come along with that. And as I mentioned, I'll be sharing the narrative therapy exercise. It's called Tree of Life at the very end after Victoria's presentation. So newcomer youth, who do we mean when we talk about newcomer youth? I feel like probably this is very familiar to you all, but and yeah, please add your thoughts in the chat. I'll be really curious to hear what your experience is of this, but language really matters in our programming and how we offer it to the youth we work with. A lot of the time, even I'm thinking about the category of youth. You know, in my program, we work with 13 to 24-year-olds, but oftentimes with older youth, they might be coming to Canada a little bit later in their life, and they might age out of some of these programs that are offered, and then might not quite fit in with older or adult newcomer programs. So these are, you know, direct implications of how we define these categories. And when it comes to newcomer, there's all these different intersections with newcomers. So as a youth worker, I think a lot about who are visible or less visible as newcomer youth, and working with, for instance, queer and trans newcomer youth, being mindful of that, how often this kind of population of youth can feel further marginalized. And I think Victoria is going to touch on this a little bit more, but you know, within newcomer youth, we're also talking about youth that are come undocumented. Their status might be more precarious, or that they might have come unaccompanied to Canada, and that can also inform a very unique experience. And so all of that being said, I think as a youth worker, I get really curious with the newcomer youth I meet and understand what it means for them to be defined as a newcomer, what it, you know, their values are, their evolving sense of self, because obviously over time that can change. I'm just going to go ahead and admit Daniel here. But yeah, again, I feel very curious about how other people might experience these categories in your work, and how oftentimes it's very policy driven when we work. I'm sure we'll have more conversation about this later. So, newcomer youth and education. So in the education system, we have younger youth that enter and then older youth. And so when I'm talking about older youth, I'm thinking maybe the 16 to 20-year-olds who arrive in Canada and start high school or try to complete part of their high school. And their different experiences can really inform the way they integrate in Canada. I've worked with younger youth that, though there are very many challenges, there's usually the support around family, that there's a bit more of a gradual adjustment happening in the school system, whereas older youth have a bit of a harder time because there's just less time to adjust to the high school setting, or even like before they have to graduate, there's just a lot more pressure. And all of this can lead to possible disruption of schooling and their education pathways. And I'm also always considering how the pre-migration trauma that some of the youth we work with can bring and carry, and that stress on the physical and mental health as they're navigating, high school. So these are always these multi-layered things we think about when we're working with the youth we work with. And I think that school settings are so important as a location for integration for newcomers, and that sometimes there's a missed opportunity, I think, for more programs designed to really work on that self-esteem piece and confidence building in school settings, because we know that newcomer youth face a ton of discrimination. There's the bullying and racism that we hear about, and not only the other kind of barriers, but those things can really impact a sense of self for youth. And so I think we can bring that in our work as well. I have spoken a bit about challenges, but just to kind of go over this, I think when we talk about supporting newcomer youth, we know that they come to Canada with a multi-layered experiences of needing to adjust to a social, cultural environment, as well as forming their identity, and also those systemic barriers that they might have when they're in different settings around like the biases. I'm thinking about maybe teacher biases or school biases where there's not as much encouragement of newcomer youth to succeed. And we also know that learning environments can really impact where newcomer youth succeeds. So if a home environment, you might not have the personal space to study, how does that kind of impact your ability to do well at school? Or if you've had experiences where perhaps you were bullied at school, and then added to that the language barrier, it might be very challenging to perform well. And I think that these things need a system-wide kind of way to address, because schools are just loaded with such a lot of, responsibility, kind of help this group to kind of integrate when they aren't necessarily resourced. And then I also think about with newcomer youth, there is a lot of stress with performing well in school as an avenue to kind of succeed in life. And that can lead to some self-doubt and anxiety and mental health issues that we've seen a lot coming in at the end of, COVID, or not that we're really at the end of it, but, having spoken to a lot of youth that have a lot of struggles with the last few years of studying whilst being in the pandemic, that pressure to succeed is really on their mind. Cannot not mention strengths. however, because there's a lot of challenges, but also at the same time, working with Newcomer Youth, we know that they have so many strengths. And I think a lot of it requires us as either people in the community or workers or perhaps your teachers to really help support youth to navigate those resources to be able to thrive. And I think some of the things I've really appreciated is to hear from Newcomer Youth how their own initiatives to combat isolation and using technology and different platforms to build community and share, a bit more of a mutual aid kind of situation, which I think is really amazing to see. So I recognize that there are a lot of strengths with working with Newcomer Youth that I've really learned a lot from and appreciated. So some takeaways and tips as from my experience of working as a Newcomer Youth worker is that creating intentional spaces for youth to express their challenges of adjusting to life in Canada, and finding places in schools or in your own programs to do that, I think is really valuable. And naming what are the barriers, the systemic barriers that newcomer face in your programming, and really centering youth. I'm sure these things are all very familiar to you, but all the intersections in working with youth. And then again, using approaches that amplify the youth's voices. So I'm going to share with you an exercise later, the Tree of Life exercise, which I think has been very successful in our work with youth in schools, because we've been able to connect with their strengths and their values and really give a space and create that space where youth can express what their experiences have been. So yeah, I'm going to stop there and hand it over to Victoria to do her portion of the presentation. Thanks.
Can everyone hear me? Perfect. And so Nadia is going to be sharing my PowerPoint for me. So I'm going to, and she pulls that up, but as she's pulling that up, okay, got it there. My name is Victoria. I am the Anti-Human Trafficking Youth Coordinator at the FCJ Refugee Center. Thank you so much, Loretta, for starting us off. Honestly, a lot of the different themes that you were talking about, and the spaces, the intentional spaces that you were talking about creating as well, is definitely something that a lot of service workers need to be mindful of, including myself. And I'll definitely get into that as the presentation moves forward. Next slide, please. Okay, so a little bit about me. So I was actually born and raised in Canada, but of course with Latin American roots. My father is Ecuadorian and my mom is Guatemalan. My mom came to Canada as a refugee, and my dad actually came as a sponsor. And so I always say like I had the best of both worlds. Both a lot of times when people ask what my background is, I always say that I was born and raised in Canada, but I have Latin roots. And so I always, every time growing up, I had that influence, kind of that cultural influence. I do identify as Latina, and obviously with the Spanish speaking as well. But of course, being a child of immigrants as well, I did experience and witness a lot of the challenges that it was like growing up here in Canada and seeing my parents struggle as well, trying to make ends meet and really build a future here in Canada. And so, yeah, so just kind of a background of, my education. So I did go to Ryerson, now it's called Toronto Metropolitan University, TMU. I got a BA in Arts and Contemporary Studies. A lot of people don't know what Arts and Contemporary Studies is, but basically it's a program that it's a mix of social sciences and humanities, so combined. So definitely going into that program and getting my bachelor's degree, it allowed me to build upon kind of like more theoretical work and a foundation where I know certain, like I know different theories, and I know the different like terminologies that often people use in the social space. But I remember upon graduation, I didn't have the practical skills to continue to move forward with my education. I was kind of lost and I didn't know what I wanted to do. And then I began to, I was lucky enough to get a job at a nonprofit. And at the time, I didn't really know what a nonprofit was. So I got a job at a nonprofit and I realized I really wanted to get into international development work. And so I did a postgrad at Humber College for international development work. And after my postgrad, I definitely had more of a drive and more of kind of like a vision of what I wanted to get into. And of course, building upon my lived experience, of course, being second generation child of immigrants, I wanted to really work with the newcomer population and really work with the newcomer population and just I really tried to look for different opportunities to really gain that experience, obviously in the field, but to also find, I guess, a place where I felt like I really wanted to get into, if you know what I mean, just because that was something that I was definitely really passionate about growing up and just seeing the struggles that my parents have gone through. And so I was lucky enough to land a job at the FCJ Refugee Center. Initially, I was the anti-human trafficking youth worker, but over time, with a lot of different positions being changed, I ended up being the anti-human trafficking youth coordinator. Both positions are similar, but definitely anti-human trafficking youth coordinator is a lot more focused on the anti-human trafficking sector. And so definitely working at FCJ in the sector allowed me to learn a lot about human trafficking and especially the vulnerabilities that newcomer youth face or youth with precarious status face in Canada in relation to trafficking and what makes these youth so vulnerable. And so that is currently where I'm at here at FCJ, and I'm continuously growing and learning. And I'm always open to learn new things. And so, as Loretta was mentioning earlier, like I'm definitely not here to say that I know everything, to speak at you. Definitely not at all. I'm 100% still learning. But I am just here just to kind of provide the things that I've learned while being in this field and the things that I've learned while working with youth, not only in youth work and programming, but also being a part of the anti-human trafficking team and working with different people who have been who have experienced trafficking and who are in conditions of trafficking as well. And so yes, I would very much love this presentation to be a conversation. Next slide, please. Okay, so just some learning objectives. I always love starting presentations off like this, just to kind of like organize where my thoughts are coming from. And so I really wanted to get into intersectionality, which I'm sure as service providers, you all have an idea of what that is, and Loretta did touch upon it. And then I wanted to get into who are precarious status migrants. Then I wanted to talk about youth without status, some systemic barriers that youth without status face, and also those with precarious status. And then I wanted to end up with talking about unaccompanied and separated children. Next slide, please. Okay, intersectionality. And so, as I mentioned, I'm sure this is a concept that a lot of people are familiar with, considering when we did introductions, a lot of you are service providers or in the field. And so I'm just to kind of like read what it says here. This is a term that is coined by Kimberly Crenshaw to describe the lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it locks and intersects. It is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own experience with discrimination and privilege. And so some examples of youth having these different intersectional identities are below. So here it says immigration status, language, race, ethnicity, sexuality, gender identity, religion, mental health, or any other aspect of their identity. And so definitely as a youth worker, working in this field, and of course, I working as well in other volunteer positions and working with youth, I realized that intersectionality is something that I definitely try to apply in every single place that I'm in every single work that I'm doing. This is a framework that I always try to keep in mind. And of course, oftentimes when you're in a certain situation, it's hard to kind of to come back to this place. We're like, okay, you have to acknowledge like all the different identities that these youth have, and at the end, it does impact their journey, and it does impact what they're going through. And so definitely, this is something that I always try to keep in mind in all of the work that I do. And as we continue on with this presentation, we're going to be looking at youth settlement and wellness using this intersectional lens. And so this means that we're going to be examining, the different processes, practices, and structures that increase the risk of newcomer youth experiencing disadvantage or discrimination because of these intersecting identities. And of course, as I mentioned, this could very much be a conversation. And so if anyone ever wants to make a comment or wants to say something, I think afterwards I'll be asking a question, but feel free to make a comment in the chat or raise up your hand if you wanted to add on to anything that is being said here. Next slide, please. Perfect. So who are precarious status migrants? So before I started working at FCJ, precarious status migrants is something that I was not familiar with at all, like this term. Me growing up as second gen, growing up and going, to TMU now, and learning about like newcomer issues, like this is something that wasn't really talked about. And so actually working in the field and getting that kind of hands-on experience and really talking to different youth and different people that are going through different processes is something that I got to do as I was working in the field. So I think this is something that isn't really spoken about much. And so I just wanted to go over this a little bit, just so everyone could have an idea of where I'm coming from, where we are coming from when we say precarious status migrants. And so these are migrants that basically that it refers to migrants that hold some form of uncertain migration status. And so there is a question of one's immigration position in the country. And so there's a question of one's rights, entitlements, access to services, responsibilities. This is something that isn't determined so easily. And so I've named some examples here. So here are temporary foreign workers, migrant workers. So these are people who are part of the temporary foreign worker program, where Canadian employers hire foreign workers to fill short-term labor and skill shortages when no Canadians are available to do the job. So actually here at FCJ, we do have an anti-human trafficking program, and we have something called the Migrant Clinic, where we do hold many, so we have something called the Migrant Clinic, where we do have basically a program where we provide these services to those who have been exploited or in positions of labor trafficking or sex trafficking. And so definitely precarious status definitely affects temporary foreign workers, and it is a part of their journey, and it's a part of the reason why a lot of workers fall into a place of exploitation and fall into a place of trafficking. International students are temporary residents who are legally authorized to study in Canada on a temporary basis. A lot of people, so these are, so the international students are considered precarious status migrants. And, a lot of people don't realize that international students are definitely those who, first of all, have to pay international fees to study, which is an immense amount of money. We have seen a number of cases here where youth come to the center where they had to borrow a bunch of money from back home to even come to Canada to pay these fees. And therefore, after their studies are over, or even during COVID, we saw this where a lot of these students had to go back home. They weren't able to because they owed a huge debt back home. Therefore, it was dangerous for them to go back home because they weren't able to pay off this debt. And so international students are definitely fall under the precarious status migrants, because a lot of international students, I'm not saying all international students, but many are in situations where their status are insecure, or they have feelings of insecurity with their status, and having that fear of going back home as well, or being sent back home because perhaps they're not able to study anymore. Perhaps they're going through there are different processes here in Canada that make them unable to study. And so they definitely fall under the precarious status migrants. Visitors, so these are people who enter Canada as a visitor. And so here at the center, we definitely, at the FCJ Refugee Center, we see a lot, actually the majority of our clients are, actually I'm not gonna say majority because I don't have a list in front of me, but at least the ones that I've spoken to and we provided services to are fall under the visitor category. And so what happens is they enter Canada as a visitor. It basically, you know, but with the intention, so coming to Canada with the intention of visiting, and then, you know, realizing that, you know, they like Canada, we have a lot of the resources that perhaps they don't get back home, and these is what clients have told me personally, so they would like to stay. But of course, visitors don't have access to a lot of the resources that I as a citizen would have access to, or that would come easily to me. So visitors, for example, cannot work because they would need a work permit, but they're not able to receive a work permit because they fall under the visitor category. And so, of course, and going back to the migrant workers, a lot of migrant workers that come to reach our services perhaps come here as a visitor with the intention of visiting, and then run out of money, then they have to work and they take under the table jobs, and then they find themselves in situations of exploitation. And as I'm talking about this, this includes youth as well. I have received a number of clients who are youth, perhaps in their 20s, youngest with possibly 19, that came to Canada with the intention of visiting, but then ran out of money, so had to work under the table, and then were in situations of exploitation, and that led to labor trafficking. And so visitors are definitely those who fall under precarious status, because it's that constant living of insecurity, of, you know, that insecurity and not having kind of access to the resources that me as a citizen would have access to. Anyone involved in sponsorship breakdown. And so what a sponsorship breakdown is when your sponsor can't or won't provide for some or all of your basic needs. And so oftentimes in this situation, we see, for example, someone sponsoring their spouse who comes to Canada, and then they find themselves in a situation of domestic abuse. And so they leave the home, and then, you know, then what happens is go through this process, sponsorship breakdown. So of course, the sponsor can no longer provide for their basic needs. And so we kind of go through a process depending on the person's situation of sponsorship breakdown. And of course, again, these fall under precarious status because position here is insecure. There's always that constant fear of being sent back home, where perhaps there are other things that are happening back home, etc. And so lastly, I wanted to mention, well, not lastly, because I'm still going to keep talking, but lastly, I wanted to mention people without status. And so, of course, these are people who have not been granted permission to stay in the country or has overstayed their visa. And so for those without status, a lot of those people probably come into Canada as a visitor, and then they overstay their visitor visa, and then therefore they become someone without status, or perhaps the technical term would be undocumented. So usually those with precarious status overall don't have access to healthcare, safe work, secure housing, and there is this constant fear of being removed from the place that they know as their home, which ultimately affects their wellness. And because we're speaking in the framework of youth, it ultimately affects youth wellness as well. And I hear someone's mic on. I don't know if you want to ask a question or you want to have a comment. Or perhaps before I continue, does anyone have a comment about precarious status migrants? Is this something that you see in your work as well as a service provider? Okay, we'll move on. We'll definitely get to conversation at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. Okay, so youth without status. And so as I mentioned before, a youth without status, or someone that doesn't have status here in Canada, is someone who has not been granted permission to stay in the country or who has overstayed their visa. So this term can cover a person who falls between the cracks of the system, such as refused refugee claimants. And so, and again, refused refugee claimants, those who came in as a visitor, but then decided to stay in Canada, and so therefore they became someone without status. Those who came in as an international student, and then decided to, perhaps something happened where they couldn't continue their studies. They could no longer afford the fees that international students have to pay. And so therefore they become a youth without status. And so this is definitely someone without status, definitely has limited or no access to the essential services that perhaps myself, and I always use myself as an example because I know myself, that I have access to the essential services or supports. And so their pathways to status are extremely limited, and most often simply is not there. And so, you know, since we're using, as I mentioned before, and even Loretta started talking about, since we're using an intersectional lens, it's important to acknowledge the unique experiences that youth have with discrimination, as Loretta mentioned, with discrimination and privilege because of their precarious status. And so a lot of youth, and you know, I see in my work, a part of my job is access to education. And so it's enrolling students into school, youth into school. And so it is heartbreaking to see that youth without status, enrolling, the school process and the enrollment process is extremely difficult. Of course, Toronto, in my experience, Toronto is a little bit, it's easier, but it's still difficult, easier to enroll kids in school than other areas around Toronto, but it's still extremely difficult. So a lot of times, you know, I come into contact with youth that have this desire to want to complete their studies, to finish their studies, to go to high school, but it's just really difficult because there's just a number of requirements that those without status have to show, like additional barriers that those without status have to, first of all, go through, but also requirements that they have to demonstrate to the school in order to go. And so before I move on, I just wanted to name a specific case example that happened here at the center and I've been in contact with. And so, as I mentioned, you know, as part of the anti-human trafficking team, I support the team with human trafficking cases. That includes sex trafficking, but of course, most often we do deal with a lot of labor trafficking. And so, as mentioned, this is still very much in the framework of youth, because a lot of the cases that are given to me as a youth coordinator are youth going through situations of labor trafficking. And so this example, so as mentioned, I worked with youth that have been in situations of labor trafficking. And in this one particular case, there was a youth who did not speak any English, who had difficulty finding a job because, of course, as I mentioned, those without status don't have work permits. And so they are put in this position where they have to find under the table jobs in order to make a living here in Canada, to buy food, to have housing. And this person as well was desperately looking for a place to live because they're running out of money to pay for their rent. And so this youth got connected to, someone, a friend, claiming to provide free housing and a well-paying job, okay? And so this youth not knowing any English, in a desperate situation where they're trying to have housing and trying to sustain themselves here in Canada. Of course, when you hear, you know, someone is willing to provide housing and a well-paying job, like, you'll go for it. And so without knowing where they were going, they ended up being transported 9 hours away from Toronto with other workers as well. There were other workers in this situation. And once arriving to the destination, of course, it wasn't what the trafficker or the friend, which wasn't a friend, the trafficker promised at all. This youth ended up working for a full month without getting paid because the trafficker claimed that their wages were being deducted for living expenses and for food. After the month, they were extremely malnourished because they were only fed one small meal a day So it was only during lunch, and it wasn't even from the trafficker. It was from their employer where they were working, provided lunch at the place. And so they only ate that one meal a day, and then the rest he had to figure out what to do. Sometimes he was also with other workers. Sometimes they would share and combine meals together. So then they were all able to eat and drink some water. And so it was a very difficult situation. And so for this particular case, this is one example of a youth who was vulnerable to being trafficked due to the systemic barriers to housing, barriers to language, and work that many non-status and precarious youth status are faced with. And so I definitely, I wanted to bring this example just to kind of paint that picture that oftentimes, yes, youth without status, a lot of people have this idea of, and I say a lot of people because in my personal life, talking to people who are outside of this sector, have this idea of, people who overstay their visa, are just, don't want to go back home, want to use disgusting remarks about, wanting to use our resources, our Canadian resources, and they're taking all of our jobs and X, Y, and Z. But of course, it's just far from the case. A lot of people who come to Canada perhaps sometimes come to Canada with the hope of building a life and adding to the Canadian economy and adding and working, to make a living, but not only to make a living, but to also oftentimes youth are the #1 providers for families that are back home. And so that are going through impoverished situations. And so there's a lot of misconceptions in the media about youth without status and youth in general with precarious status. And I think it's really important as service providers to, in our work, when we are faced with these type of questions, or when we're faced with something like this, people saying, things that are contrary to reality, it's important to kind of, face, I guess, confront these issues is what I'm saying, and really say the reality of the situation. Next slide, please. So systemic barriers. And so, as I already mentioned, there in the case that I brought, there were a lot of systemic barriers that this youth was facing, which includes equitable, safe, and secure housing, lack of access to primary physical and mental health care. And the reason why I say this is because when they were transported 9 hours away from Toronto, and when they were, they didn't speak any English. At one point, this youth got extremely sick, did not have access to healthcare because they didn't speak English, and their trafficker at the time was saying that, oh, you don't just go to work and you'll be okay. And so what I mean by lack of equitable access to primary physical and mental health care, of course, lack access to healthcare, but also in a way that don't even know the rights here in Canada and don't even know like how to access is what I'm trying to say, how to access healthcare, especially when there are other people saying contrary things in order to benefit them. Having difficulty accessing education at every level from kindergarten to post-secondary. In addition to language and identification barriers, they also lack access to accurate and trustworthy information, which makes them vulnerable to scams, misinformation, sex and labor exploitation, and other precarious work conditions. And so I also wanted to bring in another case of a different situation of a youth who came to the center as well. Let's pretend this youth's name is Bill. Of course, that's not their name, but let's pretend their name is Bill. So Bill was a non-status youth that came to the center for an orientation on humanitarian and compassionate application, which is an application for those who don't have status to attempt to legitimize their status here in Canada. It is one of the only pathways that those without status can take, and it is extremely difficult to receive some sort of status from that application. And so upon further talking to this youth, upon further talking to them, it became apparent that legitimizing immigration status was not the only need that this youth was facing. Bill had expressed their need in accessing mental health care, but not being able to access it due to their lack of status. We tried connecting him to a primary health clinic, but he had told us that he already tried connecting to a primary health or a health clinic and a mental health clinic, but he's been on a waiting list for some time now. And of course, as you know, there are a lot of amazing organizations doing amazing work out there, and providing these services to those who don't have status or those with precarious status. But of course, there's a wait list. Of course, there's a wait list. And so this youth was becoming very exasperated and frustrated, of course, with all reason to be. And when we continued to speak to this youth, he started, expressing his concerns about being discriminated against at his job. This youth had worked in a construction-related job, and he revealed that he was being discriminated against because of his sexual orientation. And so again, intersectionality comes into play here, and the different identities of different youth, immigration status, sex, race, even sexual orientation comes into play as well, with the different discrimination and privileges that youth face. And so with this particular youth, they were telling us that he was just facing a lot of difficulty at work because of his sexual orientation and being discriminated against. He started saying that he felt like he couldn't leave his job because it was risky finding another job because of his precarious status, and because he had to work obviously under the table jobs because he didn't, of course, because of his precarious status, he didn't have a work permit. And so as we continued speaking to him, he also revealed that his living conditions he felt unsafe as well. He had multiple roommates whom he didn't get along with, and overall just didn't feel secure where he was at right now. And what played a huge factor was his sexual orientation. He just didn't feel secure because of who he identified as, and he felt just being discriminated against, and he felt that he was just being targeted because of that. And so, as we continued talking to him about these other issues he was facing, we started, of course, regathering his documents to see what kind of support that we could provide him. We noticed that he didn't have his passport. And so we asked where was his passport. And then he said that he had sent it in the mail. He sent it to the mail to some location because someone told him to. And so again, this case is an example of the different barriers that this youth had to face. English was not his first language. He lacked safe housing or feeling safe in the type of housing he was staying at. He lacked equitable access to mental health care while being on that waiting list for so long. He had language barriers as well, and identification barriers. He didn't have a proper identification because he had misplaced his passport, misinformation as well. Of course, when you are a newcomer arriving to Canada, you definitely face a lot of situations where you're just trying to find information and trying to find resources to establish yourself and find your place. But a lot of times, this is one example of many examples that perhaps you as service providers have come to face with, but also like myself that I've come to face with as well. Next slide, please. So unaccompanied and separated children. When I began working here at FCJ, this is also something that I was unfamiliar with. It was when I worked a bit for Center for Refugee Children, where I started to learn a little bit more about unaccompanied and separated children and who exactly fall under this category. And so a lot of what I say here is I grabbed from the resource of Center for Refugee Children. They're an amazing organization, definitely check them out. But basically, unaccompanied and separated children are individuals under the age of 18. While in practice, older children, 15 to 17-year-olds, they would identify as youth rather than children. An unaccompanied child is a refugee or migrant child who is in Canada alone without their parents or legal guardian. Separated child is a refugee or a migrant child who is in Canada living apart from their parents or legal guardian, but is under the care of another member, relative, or caregiver. And so here are just a list of distinct barriers that pose challenges to unaccompanied and separated children's successful settlement, access to justice, basic needs and income security, shelter, housing accommodations, access to education, and healthcare. So I think what's really important about looking at this list is that these issues are extremely complex and they're most often overlapping. And so when addressing these challenges and these issues, it's really important to address them, as I mentioned, with an intersectional lens, which is why I say that I use that in my work all the time, because, you know, it's really easy to try to focus on one thing, but then you realize upon talking to the youth or to the child and seeing the different areas of their lives that it's very much, it intersects and overlaps, and it's very complex. And so instead of me explaining each one, I wanted to bring another case example for a particular youth that falls under this category. And so let's name this youth Lily. And so Lily connected to our center through our youth programming. When Lily connected to us, she was attending high school. She was working a part-time job on the weekends and evenings. And so basically Lily fell under the separated child category as she was living apart from her legal guardian. And the reason being is there were issues that she didn't specifically disclose to me that was happening. And so she had decided to leave home and she was living apart from her guardian. And so she, when, you know, every time for Lily, every time I saw her, she would always kind of express, we would sit down and have a conversation and she would express her frustrations with, you know, with going to school. She wanted to continue going to school, but of course, English wasn't her first language. And so she wanted to continue, but she was just having a difficult time getting through the course, especially because she was so tired from already working a side job as well, having to go to work after school to gather up money in order for her to live, to have I guess, pay her where she was staying at, like it was at a relative's house, because she was expected to pay and contribute to the household. And so she was just expressed her frustration, having to finish high school while working, and then trying to resolve her housing issues, and of course having you know, that insecure income as well, because oftentimes work would be really busy and oftentimes it would just drop, there would be no work. And so she felt like she had to earn her place, I guess you can say, and with this new relative that she was staying at. And so of course, being an unaccompanied, in this case a separated child, poses a number of different issues as well. And you know, oftentimes, and again, I mentioned myself because I was born and raised here in Canada, my parents did an amazing job with providing for the family. When I went to high school, all I had to worry about was going to school, staying there for the full day, learning, doing everything, and going home and hanging out with friends and watching TV or something. But in the case of Lily, this was not the case whatsoever. Lily had to worry about making a living for herself, had to worry about paying for rent, had to worry of the issues that were going on at home with her guardian, finding housing for herself. She was couch surfing a lot of the times as well. And so again, these are issues that many youth face, not just unaccompanied and separated children, many youth face, but it's just very, I guess, shocking, but also it's very common for situations like this to happen when you hear that it's someone that is going to high school, you know. It could be perhaps if you think about yourself going to high school and the friends that you were in contact with, like perhaps one of them are going through a situation like this. And it's really, I don't know, for lack of a better term, I would say it's just really like shocking, but also these things are much common than you would think, right? That a lot of these children, unaccompanied and separated children, but also youth, face these different challenges, additional challenges, and newcomer youth face these challenges in their lives. That is it on my part. I think the next slide is the last slide. I think it's like my contact info. Yes, and so that is it on my part. I know that Loretta has another little part, another little activity that we'll all hopefully be participating in and perhaps have more of a conversation. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thanks so much, Victoria. That was incredible. I am going to share my screen, and maybe whilst get this set up, if folks want to kind of get a piece of paper, and it's up to you if you want to join in with this exercise. It could just be helpful to listen and reflect in your own time. But if you want to join along, recommend getting a piece of paper and any art materials, or just a pencil or pen works fine. Goes. So, as I mentioned, I was going to share a narrative therapy exercise called the Tree of Life. And it is a therapy tool. And for those of you who might not be familiar with narrative therapy, I wanted to share a little bit about that and why I think this exercise or tool is could be useful with your work with Newcomer Youth, and how we have used it in the program that I'm part of. So narrative therapy was started by Michael White and David Epstein in the 1980s. They really emphasized the importance of looking at the social context, the political and historical forces that play out in people's lives, with the clients that they were seeing that were seeking support around the issues going on. So it really takes a non-pathologizing and more of a collaborative approach, where, you know, as facilitators, as workers, as people supporting Newcomer Youth, you know, we're taking a non-expert, co-exploring kind of stance in this exercise. And there are some basic kind of pieces or foundations in narrative therapy. And the first part is that narrative therapy, the emphasis is on telling a story, right? We're telling our own story. We're hearing the Newcomer Youth we work with, what their story is, and the importance of stories and narratives in how it shapes who we are and how we understand ourselves. Externalizing is a really key part of this exercise in narrative therapy, because the idea is that people can often feel like they are their problems, or made to feel like they are their problems. But in narrative therapy, the emphasis is that we are trying to help support people to see it from a different point of view, where it is outside of themselves, so they aren't their problems. And that might look like reframing, using language to help folks to get a vantage point on some of the problems they face. And of course, stories are created in context. And I think about, you know, a lot of the things where Newcomer Youth are navigating, how the stories about their life and that journey of like finding themselves in a new environment, what are those stories that Newcomer Youth are telling themselves or sharing with their peers, or perhaps the stories they have with their families or wider communities. These are all part of their experience. And so in a way, we actually live multi-storied lives. And the other part of narrative therapy that is really key is that the understanding that identity is social and relational. So we are always developing our sense of self in our relationships. And it can also mean that we form collective identities, and how important that is. But there are some times when we can have negative identities, or not negative, but identities that feel like they're totalizing. So they can feel really blended with the person. And what I mean by that is, you know, when I've worked with a youth who've said things that they believe are who they are, they might share things like, you know, I'm no good at this, I'm hopeless. You know, that's becoming an identity story about how they see themselves, that they are a person that feels hopeless all the time. Whereas if we help that person to maybe reframe it and get a vantage point, there can be more space for different stories. and to build on people's resilience, they build on their own skills. So my hope is that we can go along with this exercise together, and I can share how I might do this with individuals or groups, and feel free to jump in with questions as we go along with this. So the Tree of Life exercise is a narrative approach that you can work in your work with young people, especially who have gone through difficult times or maybe even traumatic experiences. It's designed to really help folks see what their skills are, what their abilities, and build on that sense of hope, like I was saying. And it was developed by Nazer Lundela with the help of David Denver in 2005 in her work with children who had lost their parents to HIV and AIDS. And the piece that's really important with this exercise is that sometimes people will bring up really challenging experiences that they've had, right? And as facilitators, and in my experience, I feel it's really important that we do guide it. We are, there to support folks so that it feels like a safe enough space that they share things that they feel they're okay to share. And that we might even design this activity in a way where people may limit their sharing. For instance, if you notice a lot of the same people sharing and it's taking more space, you might offer that you want to hear each person share one thing. There's ways we design this so it's more of an open sharing. I see a chat. Oh, I think the question is if we have a recording, and yes, there is. Thanks for the question. Okay, so Tree of Life, this is one I just sketched, and it can really look like any kind of way. I like to also emphasize when I'm doing this with youth that there's no one way of making your Tree of Life. It can look any way. There are so many different kinds of trees, and not to be hung up about it. If it helps, I can offer that, maybe bringing an outline of a tree to start people off if they feel more comfortable with that. It doesn't have to look as complicated as this, but but as an example. And, if you're doing this right now along with us, you can just sketch out a rough way of looking at a tree, and you can change it later even if you like to. So usually when I introduce this activity, I like to do a bit of an icebreaker with youth, and we found that youth really like to talk about, obviously, some of the things that remind them of their home country. So we've asked them, what trees do they know? What are some of the trees from different countries they know of? And that kind of gets people going. And then we invite participants to think of a tree and all of its parts, and imagining that each part represents some facet of their own life. And so even in this exercise for yourself, thinking about the tree that has all these different parts, the roots, what the roots might represent for you. And I'm going to guide you through each part, but we usually try to brainstorm at this point at the beginning of the activity, what the youth think different parts might represent. And there's no right or wrong. Again, if it makes more sense to the youth that one part means this part of their life, I encourage that, because it's really designed for the youth to express what makes sense for them, really. So when we've done this during the pandemic, we offered it as an online workshop, and so we had to kind of change things up a bit. So we did this in terms of in a Mentimeter, which is like a platform you can use to ask questions and share results. And so that was what people shared about the trees they know from their home country. And so roots. With roots, we're really getting the youth to think about what anchors them. So the part of the tree that makes them feel strong, and that could be treasured people in their life, favorite place from home, their birthplace, family history, maybe even sharing examples of what roots mean to you can be a way to get things going. So yeah, I welcome you to, take this time in this workshop, that if you want to reflect on, a tree of life for yourself, you can even sketch out the roots now and to imagine which different parts of your roots matter to you, that feel like that have anchored you. In my experience, when we've talked about roots, this can bring up a lot of really rich conversation with you. And I spend a good amount of time with the roots. So yeah, feel free to jot down any notes or sketch something if you like, or share in the chat. After that, we usually talk about the ground. So like a tree is situated in the ground, it represents the present, and we invite participants to reflect where they are now. So with Newcomer Youth, we've asked this question, and it can kind of be interesting because some youth have said, I feel like I'm in Toronto, but I'm also still in Afghanistan. Or, their sense of where they are now is actually like less, less clear. It can be changing, right? So I kind of give prompting questions as well. So I might say, where are the places you go to on a daily basis, like your school, what activities you do, what engages you. And then trunk. So with the trunk, participants are really, we're looking for them to share what their abilities are and their skills. And it could be what they're good at, what they enjoy doing. It could be skills like I've mentioned here, skills of caring, loving, kindness, skills of maybe like persistence or like courage, right? These could be skills as well. And if youth sometimes might come up with a bit of a roadblock at this point, because again, that sense of like maybe their self-esteem or confidence isn't there, right? Like trying to adjust to a whole new environment and setting, and then not feeling totally confident with their skills. I tried to kind of elicit a bit more from maybe, how do your friends see you? What is someone that, in your life that maybe admires what they admire about you? And at the same time, if people have nothing written, that's okay, right? Like I feel like maybe we give people the space to kind of leave it blank, and there's no need to, in my opinion, like for us to always have a lot written everywhere. It could be blank, and it could be something they come back to and they can take home and reflect on. And yeah, if you're doing this right now with us, be curious what you're putting down, with some of your skills or abilities, and feel free to share in the chat if you like. These are things that we heard from youth that we did this workshop with. So their skills, someone said that they spoke 5 languages, dance, a lot of sports, learning English, cooking, reading. And what I think is really cool about doing this Tree of Life exercise is that youth get to also see what they share in common with other youth, or what's different. And it's more of a collective exercise that you can start to see. And as we move up the tree, we get to the branches. So branches are representing our dreams, our hopes, our wishes that the participant has with their life. And so there's short-term and there's long-term direction. And we can really help frame this exercise for you to think about. Even, if we're coming to a group for a short duration of time, I might say, what's your short-term plans maybe for the next few months, if long-term feels too much, right? So yeah, the branches, and if people aren't sure, I also tend to kind of get more curious, like what are they doing, in their life right now that they're excited about? Okay, how do you expand that to maybe something they want to do if that's something they enjoy longer in their life? So here we have a bunch of different things that the youth shared around what their wishes for, some pretty long-term things, a lot of regarding really employment. Learning English came up a bit, and then also nothing. And if I had the time and with the resources to work with this group over a series of weeks, ideally, 2 to 3 sessions, I think is ideal. It would be really interesting to see how this might change. But yeah, I think sometimes you do see that, they don't have a clear direction, and that's okay. Next, as we're doing this, we talk about leaves, and the leaves of the tree are really about the participants, significant people in their life. And this can be people that are alive or past. They can be fictional. They could be friends, family, even pets. What did this significant person or figure have in your life, and what did they teach you? So that forms some of the leaves, and that's been like such a fascinating thing when we've done this before, because we get to really hear about what youth are excited to, the people in their life that they feel really connected to and excited about. And even if they're not feeling that way for themselves, it's oftentimes we can feel connected to some person in some point in our life and build on that story in their tree of life. So if you're doing this, I would even, think about in recent times, or, maybe more in your past, who was a significant person that influenced you or taught you something. And from there, we've really kind of come up with the whole tree almost. And what's left is really, we got the fruit. And fruits are what represent in this exercise the gift that the participant has been given. And they can be material, not material. It could be things like a gift of generosity, a gift of care from someone. So that really nicely builds off the leaves. Because it can be related, right? The person that was significant to you, okay, yeah, I received this gift from them. Or it could be a gift that you feel like you were born with. So some of the youth we work with said that they had a gift of creativity, or a gift of, being really interested to learn languages. That's some of the things we've heard of. And I'll take a pause here, because I did say a lot of things, and I'm curious, is anyone following along, maybe writing down notes for themselves on this exercise? And if they want to share anything from it, feel free to put your hand up or unmute. Yeah, go ahead. I'll stop sharing.
Hi everyone. Sorry, I just joined a little bit late, but I really like the exercise and the idea of using narrative approach of working with youth. One question that comes to my mind when we spend some time with the participants talking about the roots, sometimes just reflecting on past may evolve some difficult emotions in them. And then at those times, I just wanted to hear from you, how would you approach it and address that? And also a general idea about offering this program to the youth. So how many sessions, how long time period for each session you will think if you want to apply the program to the youth population. If you have any optimum number of participants in the group, it would be great if you share that with us as well. Thanks so much. I know it's a lot of questions, but
no,
yeah,
that's just really helpful. Thank you for sharing your questions.
No
actually, for this exercise, I've provided in terms of 2 sessions, but I think ideally 3 would really work best, because there's the building, yes, like kind of introduction for this exercise, and just even spending enough time really reflecting on all the different parts could cover 1 to 2. And I feel like up to an hour per session, an hour and a half could work well. Ideal number of participants, I think from my experience, like up to 10 to 15 has worked well. Bigger than that, it could be helpful to have a couple more facilitators. But I imagine if you're facilitating on your own, I think up to 15. And of course, that's depending on the group that you're working with. I'm talking about when I've been in schools, and we usually have a teacher and an assistant who are present, so that helps a little bit. And I think did I answer the questions, I wonder? But yeah, let me know if you have any more questions.
Yes, thank you for answering. In terms of difficult emotion, if they comes up during the session, do you have any technique that you use to address that?
Yeah, so I find that the sharing of people's tree of life does bring up emotions, and we want to introduce this activity acknowledging that it can bring up things for people, because we're talking about some challenges they might have gone through, and maybe there are parts of our life that were struggles that happen. And I always try to encourage folks to have a think about what they're comfortable with sharing in the space, aware of the people that are there. You know, I encourage that we don't share what's been said in the group. We want to really honor each other's stories, and the ability for people to share, the confidence to share, is if we know that we are going to keep it in that group. And if difficult emotions come up, it would be best if, you know, you can have a conversation with that youth, maybe separate to the group, if you can. But there is a part I'm going to share for this exercise that is, we talk about challenges. And hopefully that gives you some other ways of addressing that. But yeah, there's no hard or fast way. I feel like it's, you know, giving people a bit of an idea of what to expect with the activity. And then if they are feeling at all emotional and need support, letting them know how they can get that support with one person. Like maybe there's like a facilitator that takes over. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. It's great.
Okay, cool. Okay, did anyone else want to share any part of that activity, if they made notes for themselves or thoughts? And if not, I'll keep going. Okay, I'll share again. So that all I shared with you leading up to this, I would imagine would be one session. That was all part one, if you will. And part two, you would come back with the group, ideally, and do a sharing. So everyone will have drawn out their tree of life, and we invite participants to stick it up and take time to like look at everyone's trees, and we then reflect as a group. And as facilitators, we want to kind of check in with folks. If they don't want to share, they don't have to, but if they do want to share, let's be mindful of what feels comfortable or like okay for them to do so. And I also like to encourage any of the youth to write a note of appreciation or encouragement with a tree of life they see that's different to their own. Because usually, we want to kind of see what's different to our experience and how can we maybe connect with that. And it's actually such a beautiful part of this exercise, because we get to start to see our experience is not just our own, and it's a collective experience. And this part can really be a whole session in its own. And you want to get curious about everyone's different parts that they shared, and the story that they want to share around that. And I think this was kind of related to your question before, Barbara. I think part three of this is, it could be its own session, or maybe it could be what I've done before is offer as part of session two, is the storms and challenges. So we invite the participant to reflect on what are their challenges and how they have responded to them in their life. And in the drawing, you can create in the sky, perhaps the storms that they've experienced. And we want to really connect these stories that they have around their challenges with also how they responded, how they were able to, create moments of figuring things out for themselves in their own terms. And we really don't want to re-traumatize anybody. This is really important, because I find that when we start to talk about our stories outside of ourselves, it can really help to see our experiences not just our own. And also it becomes that it's less that we feel that we're victims and that we can see the story of our lives and how we participated in them. And I find that takes a kind of layer off of maybe being as direct when you're talking about your own challenges in your life, and that youth are more able to share and feel less kind of conscious when they're sharing these stories. And again, if folks are feeling like it is really challenging to talk about these stories, I would check in with the youth and see if they need some support, or maybe, we can share individually one-on-one if you have that capacity to do so. That's what I would suggest. And some of the things, and things really came up for some youth, right? Like we had youth that shared how they felt about war in Afghanistan, and just even coming to a different country, that kind of trauma that they experienced, being separated from family members, encountering a lot of problems in that adjustment period of figuring out high school, COVID, and once we start to see all the storms that come out for people, again, trying to relate them to each other and sort of connect the stories together. That we aren't alone when we're facing these things, that people have gone through before. What is it that you had done to help yourself in that time? So that is the kind of breakdown of the Tree of Life exercise that you can go through in smaller chunks with people or all of it over a few sessions. Ideally, it is a 3-session exercise, and you would end with providing the youth with a certificate or even just some kind of acknowledgement that they have done this, you know, completed their tree of life, and the things that they highlighted were their skills and their abilities, and see what their reflections are from doing this exercise. So I think that takes us up to the end of our presentations, and I believe we do have questions now. If people have any?
Actually, Loretta, I'm just going to stop recording here.